Hey everyone, thank you for watching. I am Spruha Joshi and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Opioid Epidemiology and Policy housed within the Department of Population Health at NYU School of Medicine. Today I'm going to be talking about a project that examines patterns of marijuana enforcement. While I am currently at NYU, this work was conducted by my colleagues at the University of Minnesota. Just by way of background, many states now have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes and for adult use. And so the enforcement practices that I'm going to be discussing here are kind of going to be twofold. We're going to be looking at enforcement practices within states that have legalized adult use marijuana, that is marijuana that's been made legal for individuals 21 years of age and older, and also looking at enforcement patterns in states that have not legalized marijuana for adult use. However, in this case, they may have medicinal dispensaries. A little bit of background given now of why enforcement for marijuana legalization may matter. A lot of early evidence and a lot of early work has been to examine, given now increased access of legal marijuana across the United States, what kind of adverse, if any, potential public health outcomes are we experiencing? One line of inquiry has been related to traffic fatalities. Now, this is something, the enforcement of, let's say, drunk driving, for example, is something that falls into the purview of law enforcement. With the increased access and legality of marijuana across the country, this is another item that might lead to driving under the influence. Secondarily to that, and kind of in line also with alcohol practices, while I noted that states that have legalized marijuana for adult use, they've concentrated only on making it legal for adults 21 years of age or older, similar to alcohol. So here we can see that there has been some research examining kind of this idea of compliance checks and at these legal stores to ensure that it's just adults that are actually 21 years of age or older accessing marijuana from these establishments. Now, something to remember in this context, and also with the second line of inquiry of this marijuana enforcement, is that substance use and the war on drugs is something that has existed for going on 4 decades now. And when we're talking about law enforcement and law enforcement for substance use related potential crimes, we have to keep in mind that there are clear racialized impacts of these sorts of enforcement, and something to keep in mind as we move forward with increased enforcement due to the legalization of marijuana. So the study aims here were to primarily examine what is happening at the current across law enforcement agencies across the country. What are they actively focused on? How do we ensure equitable enforcement? And do these enforcement strategies of these law enforcement agencies vary by community characteristics? So in order to do this, we conducted a national survey of law enforcement agencies. This survey was actually a follow-up of a national survey done of law enforcement agencies in 2010. The primary focus of this survey here is on alcohol-related enforcement. However, in a 2019 survey, we expanded the survey to include questions on marijuana and opioid-related enforcement activities. This, building on the original sample, which included around 1,000 large and small agencies from all across the 50 states, we, for this 2019 sample, also included an additional set of agencies in order to obtain 50% coverage. And when I say 50% coverage, I mean population coverage that these law enforcement agencies have within their jurisdiction of the 100 and most populous counties across the country. This was due to the fact that the outcome that we were using for alcohol-related enforcement was available at this level. The survey was primarily conducted, we had hoped that the survey would probably be conducted via email, but what we actually found was that with this kind of 2-response system set up for email, we ended up doing close to half of our interviews on phone, but a little bit more were done via email. The final sample resulted in 1,030 agencies out of the original 1,631 that we attempted to contact, so resulting in an overall response rate of 63%. The survey had 4 main components: agency characteristics. So this included things like how many sworn officers do you have? Do you have a full-time officer that is in charge of alcohol-related enforcement, for example, or marijuana-related enforcement? Then we asked specific questions related to the 3 substance use outcomes of alcohol, marijuana, and opioids. For this presentation, I'm going to be focusing just on the marijuana-related enforcement. So, like I mentioned before, there's kind of twofold of the enforcement activities that we were interested. One was looking at what was going on in states that have legalized marijuana for adult use, and then in particular, what was happening in jurisdictions that have legal dispensaries. So we wanted to look at these these 6 metrics for enforcement. First is marijuana retail establishment compliance check. So this is a process in which individuals that are close to looking underage will go in and attempt to purchase marijuana um, without having the proper identification. Next is whether or not what was going on with enforcement related to possession or use of marijuana for those that were under the age of 21. So something that's still illegal in these states. And then the illegal provision, or what happens to adults that give marijuana to those that are under the age of 21. What happens to those that are under the age of 21 that attempt to use a fake or false ID to purchase marijuana? And then enforcement about the hours and the sale of these marijuana dispensaries. And then lastly, enforcement activities related to public consumption. Now, in states or in jurisdictions without legal dispensaries, what we were interested in is similarly public consumption and possession, but in particular for the states that didn't have legalized marijuana, we were wondering what was happening with decriminalization. So we've heard a lot of noise, I would say, about states that are saying that, or law enforcement agencies that may suggest that, oh, we're no longer going to be enforcing small possession amounts of marijuana. We're no longer going to be charging individuals. We're only going to be giving a citation, for example, or just, which may result in, a small fine rather than something that requires them to be arrested. And so we really wanted to explore kind of what that variation is across the states. And then this is kind of one of the next steps, is that we're going to look at the concordance and discordance of the results from the survey, and then checking the policies of these law enforcement agencies if they've made them public, to kind of see what's happening kind of on the ground, and then also what are they saying. So just a little bit of background of the survey and kind of the distribution. So I mentioned that this is across all 50 states. And so in order to get 50% coverage of the population within some counties, this resulted in, in some instances, collecting or attempting to contact over 20 law enforcement agencies in places like Massachusetts and in New Jersey, for example, where they just have a lot of small towns and each town has its own law enforcement agency. This is a little bit different than a state like California, for example, that just happens to have a lot of larger counties, and so they were included in our sample. So just a little bit of average for each. The average number of law enforcement agencies that completed the survey was 20, with a minimum of Hawaii, which completed 3, which is in line with the way that their law enforcement system works. And then the most was Massachusetts with 52. So moving on to the results, first we're going to look at states that have legalized marijuana and do have a marijuana dispensary within their jurisdiction. So this first question is, has your agency conducted routine compliance checks or stings using underage, using decoys who attempt to purchase marijuana at licensed marijuana establishments? And so here, first thing to note is that the sample of jurisdictions that had a legalized dispensary within their jurisdiction was only 71. And here we can see that the distribution is for yes, that was 16, for no was 42, and 13 stated that they do not have the authority to do so. Following this up, now we have the other 5 enforcement activities that we were interested in looking in. So first is first is possession of marijuana of those by under the age of 21. Here we can see that 76% of those have reported that. Illegal provision to marijuana to persons under the age of 21, that's 34%. Public use of marijuana, 40% of these agencies reported these activities. The use of a false or fake ID was around 8%, and kind of the hours and days of sale of enforcement was just under 3%. Following this up now with looking now at states that do not have dispensaries within them, or jurisdictions that do not have dispensaries within them, the reports here are much different. So we can see here that 94% of these jurisdictions have issued a citation or a charge for the possession of marijuana, and just about 34% have issued a charge for the public use of marijuana. These numbers are much larger than and expected to be much larger given that marijuana is not legal in these states. Lastly, we were interested in what is going on with decriminalization across these jurisdictions. And so we asked this question of, does your agency actively enforce the possession of small amounts of marijuana intended for personal use? Here, we had a vast majority of agencies report that yes, they do so, with 624 agencies out of the close to 700 agencies reporting that they do this, while 63% reported no, that they do not enforce small amounts of marijuana intended for personal consumption. We also asked these agencies what their metrics for personal use were, and these ranged extremely broadly. So we're going down from 0.5 gram to up to 8 ounces. Around 70% of these agencies said that personal use was defined as less than 1 ounce, but there was also wide variation between 0.5 gram and 1 ounce, suggesting that there is stark variation in what what law enforcement agencies believe is small amounts of marijuana for personal use. So this project is a work in progress. And so a few of the next steps that I have here, and I'm looking forward to discussing what would be most interesting to examine with this data is, one, does this enforcement vary by agency characteristics? So are a lot of these enforcement activities drawn by the fact that if a law enforcement agency has a ton of resources, for example? Then also, what state and local level policies impact enforcement? So to recall, there were 13 of these agencies that reported that they do not have the ability to conduct underage stings. So examining policies such like that. And then lastly, and probably for me personally, the most interesting is to examine the neighborhood variation in enforcement activities. And in particular, are there specific neighborhood characteristics that predict these enforcement activities, such as, are there urban and rural differences in the enforcement of marijuana? Does the race and ethnic composition of a neighborhood impact how marijuana is enforced in such areas? I would just like to thank the team that really conducted all of this work. And like I mentioned, they're located at the University of Minnesota. Thank you.